So in Cambridge, England, the home of one of Britain's great universities, one of Cambridge's leading authorities, leading academics, is David Runciman. He's a professor of politics and the author of a really interesting and important new book, How Democracy Ends. So David, how does democracy end?
Well, it doesn't end with Trump, that's for starters. I think it's going to survive Trump and it's going to survive now. I think we're sort of at the beginning of the end. So there is that tendency, not just in democracies, I think in all contemporary politics, to look for these moments that are going to sort of signal something definitive. This is a long drawn out story, but I do think the political institutions we have now are struggling. And there's a fair chance that this struggle is part of a long, slow decline. So I think it ends probably this century. What we mean by democracy is only 100 years old, so it's, we're maybe halfway through, 2/3 of the way through this story. And we're in a kind of midlife crisis. I think Western democracies are. We're doing lots of strange things. There's quite a lot of acting out. There's quite a lot of behaving like we're younger and fresher than we are. But a midlife crisis is not the end of a life. It's just intimations of mortality.
But David, many historians and thinkers on democracy don't just give it a 100-year history. No. They go back to the Greeks.
They do.
They go back to the Magna Carta.
The ideas have a long, deep history, and some of those ideas are still present here. And I write about this in my book. If we were in ancient Greek democracy, we would not think it was anything like our politics. Not just because it was a relatively small group of men. It was incredibly violent. It was incredibly volatile. And it was incredibly demanding. Our democracy is designed to let us get on with our lives, and we pay other people to do it for us. It's representative democracy. But also the core institutions, the modern political party, the mass franchise, you can't really go back before the First World War for those, even in the United States.
And how would you describe it then? Everyone over 18 voting, is that the core definition of what democracy is?
Yeah, so the franchise is a big part of it. And one of the issues with our democracy is that those kind of earlier versions of it, when they got stuck, one thing you could always do was enfranchise more people. There's a way of telling the story of American democracy, which is these early versions of it kind of run into the sand, they get stuck, they get very partisan and divided. And so you bring people in from the outside, and we can't really do that. The idea, I think, that there's some obvious group of people who are unjustly on the outside, a significant part of society. That's not an option for us. That's one of the reasons why contemporary democracy, it's repeating a pattern. It's kind of stuck in this divided way, but that option is not there for it. And that is the key institution. Elections are still the key to it, but it's not just elections. It does also involve mainstream political parties offering people platforms or programs, or at least relatively coherent sets of ideas on which they can make a choice. It involves charismatic politicians who can communicate, mass communication. And you put these elements together, and it's something we can recognize from the 20th century, and we can see it in our world, but it's much, much more strained in our world.
What then is the narrative arc of democracy, if it is indeed, as you say, about 100 years old? What is the narrative arc? What has happened over the last 100 years? What would you pick out as the most salient events in the history of democracy?
So this is the other challenge that we face, that the good news story about democracy, the 20th century story where it spreads, it starts in a few places, that model, and it spreads around the world. It brings in its wake prosperity and peace. There is that version of it which takes you up to the end of the 20th century.
Is that a myth or is that true?
It's true, but you can only explain it as a result of war. So like the peace-giving, prosperity-giving aspects come out of the First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War. Those are the three salient events. The reason 1918, 1919 is the start, not just the enfranchisement of people, but also the creation of kind of modern welfare state. And to get that package that includes security and welfare and enfranchisement and so on, there is no historical example of this happening, because it happened in the 20th century, without it being preceded by catastrophic violence. It's war. And the other thing that we've learned from Thomas Piketty is that war is also the thing that reduces inequality. So without war, inequality has an inherent tendency to grow. And in the 20th century, the periods, the glorious years where inequality was finally brought under relative control in democratic states, were the post-war years, and it's post-war.
Is Piketty's point good or bad? Is it encouraging or is it very worrying?
I think that it's discouraging. There is a case, and he makes it in his book, which is it was starting to happen before the wars. If we want to find a parallel for now, we should probably go back to before that 1918 story, before the First World War, the last great age of populism, right at the sort of
1890s.
The dawn of democracy, before actually these institutions were there. You see populism, you see a technological revolution, you see it was the Gilded Age, great inequality, and it was peace. The difference is that people hadn't tried democracy then. So the result of all of this, how do you deal with that populism? Let's try enfranchisement, a welfare state, income tax. The state takes on debt to pay for public works. None of that had been done. So if you were a social democratic politician in 1900, you could say, there's just a kind of panoply of things we haven't even tried yet, and maybe if we do them. And a lot of that started to happen, and then the First World War comes. So the optimistic version of the story is there was populism, and populism triggered this kind of experimental sense that we should, let's do democracy. The pessimistic version of didn't get very far before the First World War. The reason I'm pessimistic in the 21st century is that we don't have that sense of all this untried stuff. I mean, maybe it's a failure of imagination. Maybe there are ways of doing democracy that we haven't really. But when I compare it to what you might do if you were Woodrow Wilson or Lloyd George or Clemenceau or whoever, there was the phrase I used, there was just this massive amount of slack in the system, space that could be filled with democracy.
So might it be fair to say that when we're plotting your history of democracy between 1919 and 2019, that the key year was 1989, but not because of the fall of the Berlin Wall, but because of Berners-Lee's invention of the World Wide Web?
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of key years, but a absolutely pivotal point was the mid-1970s. Watergate and stagflation and dictators coming to power in Latin America and corruption and terrorism across Europe. It was violent, it was corrupt. Every government, every democratic government in the world fell between 73 and 75.
But people didn't talk about it as a crisis of democracy back then, did they?
They did, and they talked about the risk that we were going to succumb to a coup, fascist takeover, and military takeover. It's there in the newspapers. It was part of the discourse, and it didn't happen. And what actually happened in the mid-1970s, there was this kind of fear, that the other side were winning. Actually, what happened in the mid-1970s is that democracy survived quite easily that crisis. Watergate was not the end of anything. It was the communist regimes. It was the beginning of the end of communism. So it's that, that point, it was almost the sort of crying wolf moment where the last time that people really thought, oh my God, democracy doesn't work, was the mid-70s. Not only did it work, it kind of sailed through to the 80s and beyond. The other side couldn't survive that period, and the seeds of the destruction of the Soviet empire were mid-1970s. And somehow that's fed into this. So part of, I think, our dilemma at the moment is, on the one hand, we got this fear that we're reliving the 1930s. On the other hand, we have this kind of knowledge that democracies get into these terrible fixes, and they kind of sail through them. And there is that, I've felt this for a long time, there's that, the other way to characterize this age is kind of anger and complacency go together. So the thing that provoked me, if I say this, the thing that provoked me to write this book was the election of Trump, not because I thought Trump was the end of democracy, but I thought Trump showed how much faith people still have in democracy, that they think they can elect Trump. And it's just that sort of sense that we're so angry, we can act out, we can elect Trump, it'll survive.
But why aren't the 2010s the same as the 70s? Why can't we get beyond this?
So I think we will get beyond this, and I think we will adapt, and almost certainly there are things that we can do that we haven't done yet. But even relative to the 70s, to go back to your question about 89, the technological revolution, and we're just at the beginning of it after all. This is not like we've been through some revolution and now it's going to stop and it's going to give us time to adapt. Whereas the 70s is a bit more like that, actually. Big social change, big cultural change, and democracy had to kind of catch up. And in a way, it did catch up, and it did adapt. And there was time to adapt. The Cold War wasn't, it was a drawn-out process. We're now at a point, democracy's never going to catch up with this.
Catch up with what?
With the pace of change, the pace of social change, the pace of cultural change. We're living in a world where it's both becoming more homogenous, globalized. Certain people are known by every human being on the planet. And every human's experience of information and communication is in various ways different. Micro groups, macro experiences. I think this is new. If I had to have a phrase for this age, it's the age of fragmentation. I mean, it's the fragmentation not just of sort of national polities because they're divided, but of people's experience, of their attention. The way that we encounter the world and each other is so diverse. A lot of this is positive. We live in our different ways, more different lives because we have so many different outlets for our experiences and interests. In that age of fragmentation, to capture something like the value of the people, the value of a large body of voters or contributors to the national good is so much harder. We see it differently, we experience it differently. And then there is the case that we are being divided by the technology that we communicate through.
And is that why you say in your book that Zuckerberg is a bigger threat to democracy than Trump?
The threat from Zuckerberg is not because he has evil designs on democracy, but he's built something of a scale, of a power. He doesn't understand it. We don't understand it. And it's just going to get...
But explain why Facebook is such a danger to democracy. I understand the fragmentation, but be specific. How?
It's not just that Facebook almost certainly has had an impact on elections around the world in ways that we've barely even begun to understand. And this is around the world. This isn't just Trump or Brexit. This is in the Philippines. This is in Indonesia. This is in India. This is in countries where Facebook is the internet. You can't access the internet except through Facebook. So communication is being shaped by this incredibly powerful institution that democratic institutions can't control. The democratic institutions are being themselves shaped by it. And that relationship between Trump and the Supreme Court, Trump and Congress, Trump and the American people, it could be painful, it could be fractured, it could be fractious, but it is a relationship that we can see and understand. I don't think Zuckerberg, any more than you and I, understands the relationship between Facebook and that whole set of institutions.
Isn't it curious? I mean, I agree with your point about this fragmentary age, but in this age of fragmentation, we seem to be attracted to leaders who claim to bring people together, whether it's a Trump, an Erdogan, or Putin. What's the connection between the age of fragmentation and the rise of these charismatic authoritarian leaders?
So I think it is, in a way, the obvious one, which is there is a longing for something that we haven't got. There's also there is a nostalgia there.
Isn't that the 1920s and 30s?
So that's the thing so there are unquestionably echoes, no doubt. You hear Trump, you hear Erdogan say things, and I'm sure someone from the 1930s would think, this reminds us of what was there. In the anti-Semitism, in the conspiracy theories, in that deep kind of suspicion of outsiders. So the rhetoric, I think, echoes the 1930s. And after all, we do have similar political institutions, but I do think the social conditions are so different. So the reason I'm skeptical about that idea that we are on a step not towards some next stage of democracy, but back. There's this phrase that political scientists use, we're backsliding, we're slipping back to what we thought we'd left behind. I don't think we are, because the actual social conditions for fascism aren't there. So the social conditions for fascism are a lot of angry young men, and we have a lot of angry old men, poverty, and we're relatively rich. America's saw it just now, the lowest unemployment rate since 1967 or whatever it is. We are richer, older, and more peaceful, less violent than we were. We feel it, and we, like I say, we act out in ways that manifest it. But to get the conditions for fascism, because fascism is a movement of political violence above all. It's violent street politics.
Yeah. And a movement of youth.
And a movement of youth. So we're doing our violence online. It's still violence. Twitter is still, my God, it's a place of mob violence. Angry old men can be as angry young men. It's not like this is some kind of nice, peaceful version of it. But it doesn't play out the same way. I think it's a huge mistake to think that the thing that comes after Trump or Orban is Mussolini or Hitler. What comes after Trump or Orban is something that could only happen in the 21st century.
Facebook and these other platforms, are they changing people's ontologies, particularly their political ontologies? And is there then a connection between, Trump's reality television or always-on manner of doing politics and this new world of Facebook and Twitter?
So I think it's unquestionably changing timeframes and the way in which people have their attention drawn to political issues. Not just the pace of it, but the relentlessness of it. Representative democracy works to a kind of rhythm. It has moments of intensity, moments of pause. It has set-piece events like elections. After the elections, it has moments not of reflection where it settles again. Tocqueville has this great line about the election, the river rises right to the peaks of the bank, and then it subsides, and people think, what were we getting so worried about? That's gone. I mean, the most striking thing about Trump, makes him different, I think, from any other Democrat politician I can think of, is he behaved after he won exactly the same way as he behaved before he won, as though he'd lost. It's like there isn't a parallel for that. So, is it changing people's ontologies? I don't know, but it's changing the fundamental experience of democratic life.
I know you also thinking in a more long-term way in terms of the impact of technology on democracy in the context of AI, and that you believe that AI will really shape and perhaps even end democracy. How do you see that playing out?
If we're at the start of the digital revolution, and the pace of it is picking up, and yet we've got these relatively unreformed institutions, there must at least be a possibility that what's going to happen is not that democracy snaps or breaks, but it just gets bypassed. I mean, we can keep going through the motions of elections, we can keep fighting over who's on the Supreme Court, and the pace and power of machine learning, particularly to solve problems, which is a big part of democracy. So I say in this book that the two basic things that democracy has going for it is it's a problem-solving form of politics and it's a dignity-enhancing form of politics. It gives people a sense of respect because they have a voice, and it gives them prosperity and welfare because it's good at. So if the problem-solving goes one way, the problem-solving essentially becomes an increasingly technical exercise because the machines are so much better at it, and the voice and the dignity goes the other way, then this thing really, really does start to come apart. And I think we're starting to see that now. A lot of what's driving this populism is that it is anti-expert, anti-technocratic. And people use this technology to express anger and voice, and at the same time this technology is in the hands of fewer and fewer people being used as a sort of problem-solving mechanism. If we're at the start of that process, if the voice is going to be enhanced and the technical problem-solving is going to be enhanced, it is going to come apart. And it's possible that the package, the democratic package, which is problem-solving plus voice, that was an accident of the late 20th century.
So there's nothing necessarily incompatible between technocracy and democracy. The two can somehow be interweaved.
So what would be incompatible is a democracy which is somehow collapsed into technocracy. But a world that has technocratic elements, which is the world we live in now, central banks, organizations that set the rules by which the internet operates. No one's voted for these guys or these people. Technocracy in some places, democracy in others. You could have enhanced versions of both. I mean, I think the really interesting question is what would be the issues that cause these two sides of political life to come into conflict? A world where some of it is just totally divorced from democracy, just experts deciding for us, and some of it where we are empowered and connected in ways we haven't been before.
Well, finally, David, we've got this patient, almost 100 years old. You're suggesting getting towards the end of
the end of the middle.
End of his, or I don't know whether we say a he or a she, or what gender democracy is. How do we extend this person's life?
So one way to do it is to accept a reduced version of it. There's a kind of half-life option here, where you don't have it all. Human beings live longer than they ever have, but some of the later years are with relatively minimal functions, but kept comfortable and so on. That is not, to me, that's not the way we want to go with this. You want it to be a vigorous life. That means taking risks. So there is a risk element to this. At the moment, we're clinging on to democracy. Like, we can't, let's not change any of it. There is that sort of fear of the unknown. There's this sort of line that therapists have, which is people want to change as long as it doesn't mean changing. And that's the phase we're in.
So what do we need to change?
We have to accept where we are not going to have democratic control some parts of our lives. So we've sort of half accepted it in finance and so on, but we've got to recognize that, because there's also that part of us that's in denial about it. We've got to experiment, we've got to be radical. Like I said, there's a challenge of imagination, but we could do radical local democracy, participatory democracy. We could actually give people more choice in some areas.
And we shouldn't be thinking of new political parties, maybe
We
new
should
ways
all-
of doing
new-
politics.
Yeah, new ways of doing politics, maybe not political parties. So the Labour
Black
Party
Lives
actually,
Matter,
Labour Party
those.
is now is a movement more than it is a party, and there is a kind of movement politics. There are all sorts of, the referendum is not direct democracy, that's just a kind of parody of it. But there are forms of direct participation we should do. But where we are now is in that point where we think the threat is this big, dark cloud, which is whatever it is, authoritarianism, fascism. We've got to protect this thing by not letting any of it go. And if we do that, it will just have the half-life.